In the mid-13th century BCE, an administrator for the Hittite Empire pressed a stylus into wet clay to record a dire situation. His territory was suffering from severe famine, and he needed emergency shipments of grain immediately. The surviving archive of this correspondence reveals the intended recipient for this desperate request, the new kingdom of Egypt. A few decades earlier, Hittite and Egyptian armies had clashed at the massive Battle of Kadesh, fighting each other to a bloody, exhausting standstill, before finally signing a peace treaty. Now, one of these immense, heavily armed rivals was relying on the other for its basic survival. An invisible pressure was forcing the wealthiest civilizations on Earth into a state of panic. 3,200 years ago, the Mediterranean was highly developed. It was populated by enormous administrative states that managed vast resources and constructed monumental architecture. The Hittite Empire controlled much of modern Anatolia, utilizing a formidable military to push its borders steadily southward into the Levant. Across the Aegean Sea, the Mycenaeans flourished throughout mainland Greece, ruling a dense network of surrounding territories from behind thick, fortified palace walls. Along the eastern Mediterranean coast sat a dense cluster of Canaanite city-states. Places like Ugarit operated as cosmopolitan trading hubs, housing archives written in multiple different languages. These kingdoms were not isolated. They were wealthy, sophisticated global powers, operating an intricate, overlapping network of political and economic ties. At the core of these societies sat a highly centralized system known as a palace economy. Massive complexes like Knossos on Crete functioned as combined political capitals and economic hubs. Inside, royal bureaucrats meticulously recorded the collection of basic resources like grain, olive oil, and wool from the surrounding territories. By pooling these resources, royal palaces could redistribute wealth to support large standing armies equipped with expensive chariots or fund massive public construction projects. By pulling enormous portions of economic activity directly under royal control, these societies amassed incredible wealth, but they tied their entire survival to the continued functioning of a single administrative system. That administrative system extended far past local agriculture. These central palaces relied permanently on resources arriving from thousands of kilometers away. To equip their militaries, they required copper, mined in Cyprus. They also needed tin, traveling enormous distances from modern Afghanistan. Combining these metals was the only way to produce bronze. This long-distance logistical chain was the absolute foundation of their military and agricultural output. The physical scale of this globalized network was preserved perfectly off the coast of modern Turkey, inside the wreckage of a late Bronze Age trading vessel known as the Uluburun shipwreck. This image shows one of the copper oxide ingots recovered from the site. The ship's cargo hold contained goods originating from at least 7 or 8 entirely different cultures, all packed onto a single vessel. Here we can see a surviving clay tablet covered in dense cuneiform script. Records like this reveal that kings constantly exchanged luxury goods like gold, ivory, and glass as diplomatic gifts, deliberately reinforcing alliances with foreign rulers, whom they addressed as brothers. The survival of a local population in Greece or Anatolia relied entirely on raw materials and political stability maintained by foreign kingdoms across the sea. The prosperity was immense, and the system was incredibly fragile. Operating a network this complex required absolute stability in both the political environment and the climate. By the mid to late 1200s BCE, that stability began to fracture. Modern climate researchers analyzing the region have found evidence pointing to a series of severe, consecutive droughts striking the eastern Mediterranean during these decades. Because populations relied partly on imported grain, a severe drought in one kingdom's agricultural center immediately translated into a supply chain crisis for every other empire connected to it. As crops failed, border regions that had been stable for generations suddenly experienced spikes in raiding and warfare. Contemporary records begin to reference unusual population movements. Large, displaced groups of people were migrating away from famine-shock territories. The tone in diplomatic archives shifted rapidly. The kings who had spent decades exchanging luxury goods and pleasantries were now sending frantic letters to one another, requesting immediate military assistance and warning of completely disrupted trade routes. The leaders writing these letters treated these events as ordinary, isolated crises, about harvest or a border skirmish that they could weather, just as they always had. But the late Bronze Age collapsed entirely. The empires fell because the deep, intricate interconnection that built their strength had become their ultimate vulnerability. Within a few short decades, the centralized palaces were burning. The final blow would come from the sea, delivered by a sudden, violent force that history only remembers as the Sea Peoples. Inside the wealthy coastal trading hub of Ugarit, a scribe rapidly presses a stylus into a wet clay tablet. The message is a plea for immediate military aid. It will never be sent. Blazing debris falls from the collapsing ceiling, freezing the city's final moments in the archaeological record. Archaeologists recovered these unfired letters directly from the kilns. The texts describe enemy ships approaching the coast, burning towns and inflicting severe damage, begging neighboring kingdoms for reinforcements. Ugarit stood as a fortified center of global commerce, protected by centuries of tradition and military investment. A maritime force managed to erase this entire administrative power within hours. The destruction of Ugarit initiated a region-wide collapse that systematically dismantled every major superpower in the Eastern Mediterranean. Only one major superpower survived to record its version of events: the Egyptian Empire. The clearest account of these attackers comes directly from inscriptions carved into the walls of Pharaoh Ramesses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, dating to the early 12th century BCE. The Egyptian administration's official texts describe a massive, highly organized coalition of foreign forces sweeping toward their borders, attacking simultaneously by land and sea. The carvings list distinct groups within this attacking force, names like the Peliset, the Teker, and the Denyen. 19th century scholars later grouped these separate factions under a single title, the Sea Peoples. This relief carving provides the visual evidence of Ramesses III's victory. By depicting an Egyptian archer positioned directly above a large fish, the monument documents that the engagement took place as a waterborne naval conflict in the Nile Delta. The scale of the surrounding carvings portrays a chaotic battle. By documenting the density of the enemy fleet, the Egyptian state officially positioned itself as the solitary survivor against an overwhelming world-ending army. For over a century, historians accepted this monumental propaganda as the primary explanation for the era, identifying the Sea Peoples as the sole architects of the Bronze Age collapse. To verify the Egyptian narrative, modern archaeologists followed the trail of destruction outward, examining the physical ruins scattered across the Mediterranean. The damage extended far beyond isolated coastal raids. The Hittite Empire in central Anatolia, a massive superpower that had successfully fought Egyptian pharaohs to a standstill decades earlier, vanished from the historical record. Hattusa, their magnificent capital city, was destroyed and abruptly abandoned. The archaeological layers show heavy burning across its administrative and defensive structures. Across the Aegean Sea, the wealthy Mycenaean palace centers in Greece met a similar fate. Administrative hubs like Pylos were burned to the ground. This clay tablet from Pylos illustrates a specific historical irony. The precise, grid-like organization of this linear B script records military and agricultural resources, proving the existence of a highly organized bureaucracy. The intense heat of the fire that destroyed the palace baked and preserved these administrative records for eternity. The simultaneous ruin of these distinct global superpowers, happening within a single generation, appeared to confirm the military might of the Sea Peoples. As excavations continued, archaeologists uncovered structural anomalies in the ruins that contradict the story of a military conquest from the sea. The invasion theory contains a major geographic flaw. While coastal cities were attacked, a wave of destruction markers also appears deep inland. These settlements were entirely inaccessible to naval raiders. Furthermore, the Egyptian texts link the names of several attacking groups back to the Aegean and Anatolia, the same regions that were already collapsing. This evidence points to a different reality. The attackers appear to be a chaotic coalition of displaced refugees, populations fleeing disasters in their own homelands, rather than a unified army seeking conquest. If the primary suspects in the Egyptian narrative were fellow victims running for their lives, then an invisible force was responsible for tearing down the ancient world. The physical burning of palaces and cities masks the most damaging losses of the period. The destruction occurred within the invisible systems supporting those cities. The interconnected web of long-distance trade routes across the Mediterranean broke apart, going completely dark. The regional movement of essential resources like tin ceased entirely. Without these resources, the complex administrative systems designed to manage them dissolved. In Greece, the palace administration disappeared, and the knowledge of how to read and write vanished from the region for centuries. A conquering army typically absorbs existing bureaucracies to extract wealth. These military raids do not explain a total loss of literacy across multiple civilizations. This total structural disappearance identifies a systems collapse. The foundational networks of this interconnected civilization failed so profoundly that the society itself ceased to exist. We can see the aftermath of this failure in Egypt, the empire that supposedly defeated the Sea Peoples and survived the initial crisis. Despite its military victory, Egypt emerged permanently crippled. The state economy fractured under immense strain, and the empire's international influence was broken. Repelling the physical raiders offered no protection against the death of the international trade networks that the Egyptian economy relied upon. The Sea Peoples acted as the final, desperate symptom of a global system already in the process of failing. The failure of foundational supply chains and administrative networks triggers a structural collapse, resulting in a centuries-long descent into a dark age. Smoke chokes the air. Outside the palace walls, a starving population tears at the gates. Inside, a desperate scribe presses a final message into the wet clay before the flaming roof caves in. Within a span of roughly 50 years, a network of the most sophisticated, powerful empires on Earth entirely ceased to exist. Historical tradition once blamed this ruin on a single villain, the Sea Peoples, a marauding force believed to have carved a path of fire through every major kingdom in the region. Recent excavations shifted the focus away from a single attacker. Beneath the ash, archaeologists found evidence of climate shifts, massive structural failures, and internal fractures, a pattern of physical proof pointing toward a cascading failure of the entire system. Before the collapse, the Eastern Mediterranean was deeply prosperous. These kingdoms operated out of massive administrative centers, managing highly organized palace economies. This illustrates the lifeblood of the Late Bronze Age, a deeply interconnected international trade network. Kingdoms relied on these routes to exchange massive quantities of tin, copper, and grain. At the center was food. Administrators collected agricultural surpluses, redistributing them to feed armies and craftsmen. Military power required a different kind of logistics. To produce bronze weapons, craftsmen needed copper and, crucially, tin, a resource that often had to travel thousands of kilometers along these routes to reach the forge. Centuries of optimization had created a highly efficient, globalized supply chain. But that tight interdependence meant the entire region was incredibly vulnerable if any single essential resource stopped moving. The first pressure point to hit this system came from the environment. Across the Eastern Mediterranean, the climate shifted rapidly toward drier, drought-prone conditions. We know this today because modern scientific analysis of ancient pollen samples, layered sediment cores, and regional isotope data confirm a sharp disruption in the climate exactly when the empires began failing. This cuneiform tablet perfectly matches that scientific data. Written records from multiple independent cultures, like the Egyptians and Hittites, simultaneously logged desperate requests for emergency food shipments during these exact decades. While the crops failed, the ground itself gave way. Excavations reveal structural failures consistent with earthquake storms, tight clusters of major seismic events striking along Mediterranean fault lines in rapid succession. Earthquakes and droughts rarely wipe out advanced societies on their own, but together they shattered the physical infrastructure and eradicated the foundational currency of the era, the grain supply. As the drought dragged on, the social contract broke. The small ruling elite continued concentrating wealth and controlling the remaining food stores, leaving the wider, dependent population to face extreme nutritional stress. Ordinary citizens, strained by famine, began revolting against the centralized palace administrations that had failed to protect them. The archaeological record shows destroyed sites, with damage patterns pointing directly to violent internal unrest. This domestic chaos broke the first major node in the international grid. With regions gripped by rebellion, local governments could no longer secure their borders or guarantee safe passage for merchants. Once the trade route stalled, the long-distance imports stopped. That critical supply of tin could no longer reach the local craftsmen. Without tin, bronze production halted. Kingdoms found themselves unable to arm their militaries or replace broken weapons, leaving their capitals practically defenseless, exactly as their own people were tearing them apart. The groups long remembered as the Sea Peoples emerge in this light as the byproduct of the collapse itself. Refugees fleeing failed harvests and broken governments, searching for any shore where the system still functioned. As massive groups of migrants moved across the Mediterranean, they pushed into neighboring territories, applying unmanageable pressure on the few remaining cities that were already struggling to feed their own populations. Every individual crisis actively worsened the others. Drought caused starvation. Starvation caused rebellion. Rebellion severed the trade routes. The loss of trade crippled the military, allowing the rebellions and migrations to finish the job. When the 50-year window of collapse ended, the geopolitical map was entirely wiped clean. The mighty Hittite Empire and the Mycenaean palace civilization were physically reduced to ruins. Egypt survived the cascade, but it was permanently weakened. Depleted of its resources and cut off from its trading partners, it never regained its former wealth or regional dominance. This charred Linear B tablet is a remnant of a culture that lost its ability to record history. The administrative states were so thoroughly destroyed that written language itself disappeared in some regions for centuries. The centuries that followed are marked by a drastic reduction in human population and societal complexity. The prosperous trade networks that took generations to build had to be painstakingly reconstructed from scratch. Modern historians and archaeologists refer to this chain of events as systems collapse theory. There was no mastermind toppling a golden age. The Bronze Age fell because simultaneous stresses hit an interdependent system at nearly the exact same moment. The incredible sophistication that allowed these kingdoms to share resources and span thousands of kilometers became the very mechanism that spread the destruction so completely. It leaves us with a stark historical reality. The tighter and more efficient a complex system becomes, the less resilient it is when multiple things go wrong at once. Imagine standing in the ashes of your city, holding a tool you can no longer repair because the global supply chain has completely shattered. This was the reality for millions of people across the eastern Mediterranean. When the palaces burned, global trade died, and the very ability to read and write vanished. Across the region, populations plummeted. Grand administrative centers that once managed thousands of people were left empty and abandoned. Centralized imperial power was erased from the map. In the space of a few decades, massive states that had dominated the landscape for centuries simply ceased to exist. The Hittite capital of Hattusa was left to the elements. While smaller successor states preserved their culture, the power that once rivaled Egypt never returned. Without these massive states to protect the routes and demand luxury goods, the long-distance trade networks that moved tin and copper across thousands of kilometers dried up. To those picking through the rubble, the smoldering palaces signaled the final, permanent end of everything their world had once been. Mycenaean Greece experienced the most extreme collapse of complexity. The highly bureaucratic palace administrations and the literate elites who ran them vanished entirely. Writing itself disappeared from the Greek world for several centuries, leaving a gap in the historical record that we can only fill with artifacts like this funerary vase. Because these people left no written records, we know very little about their direct experience beyond the material wealth they left behind. Yet in this isolation, something was developing. Freed from the control of rigid palace kings, small independent communities began experimenting with new forms of social and political organization. These decentralized communities eventually matured into the city-states of Sparta and Athens, independent political units that could never have existed under the old imperial system. This era of collapse forced a pivot in the basic materials used for survival and warfare. Producing bronze required tin, a resource that had to travel enormous distances. When the trade routes snapped, the supply of bronze disappeared with them. Survivors turned instead to iron. While it required advanced smelting techniques, the raw ore was widely available in local deposits across the Mediterranean. This wasn't an intentional upgrade in technology. It was a rapid, desperate adaptation to a world where the old global supply chains no longer functioned. This shift democratized the making of tools and weapons, stripping the old palace elites of their monopoly on metal and marking the start of the Iron Age. On the Levantine coast, a new civilization was emerging from the ruins of old Canaanite cities. Cities like Tyre and Sidon were now independent, operating without the oversight of the massive palace bureaucracies that had controlled trade in the late Bronze Age. Independent Phoenician merchants built extensive new trade networks that reached across the entire Mediterranean, eventually founding colonies as far away as Spain. To manage this decentralized trade, these merchants needed a fast, flexible way to record transactions and track goods across thousands of kilometers. They discarded the complex, elite writing systems of the past and developed a simplified phonetic alphabet. This flexible tool was easily adopted by other cultures, directly influencing the Greek alphabet and serving as the model for most writing systems used in the West today. While Egypt survived the collapse as a continuous state, it emerged as a diminished version of itself, internally fragmented and increasingly vulnerable to outside powers. To the east, Assyria began a gradual process of expansion, growing into a massive military machine that would apply the lessons of organization and conquest on an unprecedented scale. By the 8th century BCE, the silence of the Dark Age had broken. In its place stood an entirely new world order. International trade was no longer the exclusive domain of massive palaces. It was now driven by a decentralized, flexible model of exchange, managed by independent merchants and city-states. The Bronze Age collapse functioned as a violent pruning, clearing away the top-heavy, brittle monopolies that could not survive in a fractured world. This period of catastrophe compelled the survivors to forge the iron tools, the phonetic scripts, and the resilient social models that would define the next 1,000 years of Mediterranean history.